Many of you in St. Louis are familiar with Express Scripts, which is a local St. Louis company. We started in 1986. It became a Fortune 25 company before it was bought by Cigna in 2018. At the time of that deal, Express Scripts was one of the largest PBMs in the country. And the PBM is a pharmacy benefit manager. So we negotiate prices for prescription drugs and related services on behalf of thousands and thousands of clients all over the country. We're able to take the volume of all of those and aggregate it together to negotiate agreements with pharma manufacturers, with pharmacies, and other providers. So it's a way to maximize purchasing power for all of those smaller buyers. So about a year ago, Cigna announced the formation of Evernorth. That's the brand you're seeing here. So Evernorth is essentially the original ESI, so the pharmacy benefit manager, plus the home delivery or mail order pharmacies, the Accredo specialty pharmacies, combined with some of our care services businesses that were originally part of Cigna, and a couple of acquisitions that have been made since that transaction closed in December of 2018. So today, Evernorth is one of the largest health services providers in the country. So as Andy said, my name is Alix Catalanotto. I'm a vice president on the supply chain team at Evernorth. I lead the team that's doing home delivery drug sourcing, and we're responsible for planning, forecasting, inventory management, drug supply optimization for the 4 big high volume Express Scripts pharmacies we have around the country. So a big part of my job is ensuring we have a secure supply of drugs for the patients served by the Express Scripts pharmacy. And because of that, I've been in the trenches for many of the big drug safety stories of the last decade. Today, I'm focusing on counterfeit drugs, but there have also been major concerns about drug safety related to impurities, contaminants, and quality failures. And they all share a common theme. People trusted a source, took something from that source with the goal of getting better or treating a condition, and too often they paid with their lives. So I'm going to start with a true story. In September 2013, doctors in Paraguay were surprised by a surge of pediatric patients suffering from breathing problems. Public health authorities learned that all those children had taken a locally produced cough syrup. And when inspectors visited the manufacturing site, they found import records that showed the syrup had been compounded from the same batch of dextromethorphan that killed 60 people in Pakistan the year before. Fortunately, the compound in Paraguay was more diluted, and doctors were able to administer an antidote, and none of the children died, very fortunately. But stories like this occur around the world every year. The scourge of counterfeit drugs, which the World Health Organization defines as products deliberately and fraudulently mislabeled with respect to content, identity, and/or source. They're an ancient problem, which has confounded governments, providers, and patients alike. So we're going to spend our time today looking at the problem of counterfeit drugs, its scope, impact, sources, and then close out with a discussion about some solutions. We'll have a time for QA at the end, so please use the chat, and I believe we have the audio option as well. So Andy, okay, you'll stick on this slide for me, talk about some of these headlines. So the World Health Organization estimates about 200,000 deaths every year from counterfeit or substandard malaria medications alone. Other studies have estimated a much higher death toll when you consider the development of drug-resistant strains caused by counterfeits. It's a developing world problem, primarily Africa and Southeast Asia, but it's also a developed world problem. So these headlines are all US headlines, right? So earlier this year, Gilead, which is a major supplier of HIV antivirals, warned about fake HIV drugs found in US pharmacies. Counterfeiters were able to sell their products through unauthorized distributors using stolen Gilead packaging to mask their fraud. A similar situation happened with Janssen Pharmaceuticals in late 2020, where fake HIV drugs were being sold in Janssen packaging. An emergent problem is counterfeit COVID-related products. Ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are 2 products that are seeing a surge in counterfeits. A recent public safety alert from the DEA warned about fentanyl and methamphetamines being incorporated into counterfeit meds that are primarily sold online and through social media platforms, making them easily accessible to younger buyers. Buyers may think they're getting Xanax or Adderall, and instead are receiving these very dangerous products instead. When these counterfeit drugs contain fentanyl, the DEA is warning that 40% of those pills that contain some measure of fentanyl contain a lethal dose of fentanyl. So clearly this is a big problem even in the US, where most sources estimate less than 1% of medications are counterfeit. In developing countries, the rate can be 30% up to 60%. So counterfeiting can happen to branded and generic products. Counterfeits may include products with the correct ingredient, but fake packaging, incorrect ingredients, no active ingredients, or insufficient active ingredients, or toxins and other pollutants. It's often a complex criminal enterprise driven by the high financial reward and the relatively low criminal risk most organizations face. Some experts estimate that counterfeiters can make as much money as drug cartels, and with much lower risk. Many counterfeiters go out of their way to build elaborate facades of good intentions so that if they're caught, they can claim the problem was due to faulty controls and not criminal intent. An investigator in India once posed as a buyer interested in counterfeit meds and was taken to a sophisticated manufacturing facility where they had in-depth conversations about how fake he wanted his fake drug to be. Did he want full salt, which means that's the correct quantity of the main ingredient or the active ingredient or API, half salt or no salt? So the more salt, the more active ingredient that belongs in that product, the harder it is to detect the fraud using common techniques employed by customs agents and others who are exploring and investigating counterfeit drugs. So counterfeiters targeting developed countries use very sophisticated methods to perpetrate their fraud. See for yourself. Can you go to the next slide, Andy? We'll look at an example. So one set of these drugs is real and one is counterfeit. Now, pharmacists pay very careful attention to the color, the shape, the coating, and the markings of each product they dispense. And at Express Scripts, we have a sophisticated database that's maintained by licensed pharmacists to ensure we have the correct descriptive information for every item we dispense. So we would have the color, for this NDC, we would have the color, the shape, the markings, front and back. We would have all that documented. We often have pictures. We use that to prevent mistakes, not identify counterfeits. So visual inspection alone cannot identify counterfeits because one of these pills is fraudulent and one is real. And can you tell which one is real, the real Lipitor, and which one is fraudulent? Right? No, you can't. Just so you know, the counterfeit is on the left, which surprised me. I actually would have picked the one on the right. But that's the one on the right is the real Lipitor. So counterfeiters don't stop with the tablet or the capsule. They also fake packaging, including lot numbers, to further their fraud. The packaging problem is so significant that at Express Scripts, we actually have to secure our trash from our pharmacies to ensure that any discarded packaging is safely transported for proper disposal. We've had pharmaceutical companies come visit our sites and observe how we handle the trash with their packaging because they're so concerned about the packaging being reused to perpetrate fraud. So we're going to talk about this more later, but for now, remember that counterfeiters in the most developed countries have to be sophisticated because the controls to identify them are sophisticated. So imagine how much worse this problem is in developing countries where the regulatory environment is not robust and the demand for inexpensive therapies is very high. Add to this the fact that much of the developing world, especially in the global south, suffers from endemic malaria, pneumonia, tuberculosis, HIV, and other treatable conditions that require medications to treat them. Every year, over 200 million people contract malaria alone, just malaria. And out of that, 400,000 of them die. 90% of the malaria deaths occur in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see we have a global view here. So the global south is clearly the area with the highest risk of counterfeit medications. So I mentioned earlier, you know, the estimates are anywhere from 30 to 60%, depending on the country. So the higher risk that country is in a color coding, the higher the risk that, you know, they're likely to have lots and lots of counterfeits in the market. So the World Health Organization, again, estimates that counterfeit drugs make up 10% of the drug market, while other experts think it's closer to 15%. So again, it's that 1% in the, you know, developed kind of countries in the green, up to that 30 to 60% in the high-risk countries. So that averaging comes out to around 15%. And of all the drug sorts, the counterfeit antimalarials, antivirals, and antibiotics are probably the most insidious. These counterfeits can lead to death either by lack of protection from the disease that they're meant to treat, through toxicity of the knockoffs, and they also kill people who don't even take them because they facilitate the spread of drug-resistant pathogens. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of counterfeiters include some level of the true active ingredient in their counterfeits. It may not be present in a form that's easily absorbable by the body. It may not have enough of the active ingredient, but it's there. And what happens is, if you're treating malaria and you've got a low dosage, suboptimal dosage of chloroquine in the medication, it kills off the less robust malarial germs, and it leaves the stronger ones and they end up developing resistance to the medication. And this has actually been a major cause of the rise in drug-resistant malaria and other illnesses around the world. The counterfeiting and the suboptimal, dosing has really created an additional problem, and we're seeing like surges in some of these diseases that we thought we had made a lot of progress against because of this drug resistance. So the counterfeits are also on the rise in developed countries, largely thanks to the prevalence of online pharmacies. So if you think about in the southern countries, you'll see unofficial distribution channels are sort of the way the drugs get into the market. And we're going to talk about it on the next slide. But in the developed countries, the big entry point is really like the online market. So when the FDA buys drugs online, which they do periodically, they routinely find that more than half are fake. And the most popular counterfeit categories are erectile dysfunction, weight management, painkillers, psychiatric medications, and cancer meds. So a rule of thumb for us is if an online store is offering a prescription medication without actually requiring a prescription from your doctor, the odds of receiving a counterfeit go way up. And we're going to talk a little bit more later on about other ways you can protect yourself, but rule of thumb. In the developed countries, one of the best protections we have against counterfeiting is ethical sourcing. So we'll move to the next slide and talk about sort of the supply chain and how we can think about opportunities for the drugs entering. So within the legitimate U.S. supply chain, medicines are commonly sold directly by pharmaceutical companies to authorized distributors, which then supply the drugs to hospitals and pharmacies where they're dispensed to patients. However, drugs may also move sideways from the authorized distributors to secondary wholesalers who sell the drug to one another and to hospitals and pharmacies. It's at this point that fake or unapproved and potentially dangerous drugs can most easily enter the U.S. supply chain. So the little boxes, foreign countries, that really should, just be like counterfeiters because they can be U.S. based. It doesn't have to be foreign based, unfortunately. So pharmaceuticals purchased over the internet are another major and growing source of counterfeit medicines in industrialized countries. It's a particular threat to those seeking cheaper medicines or unauthorized treatments or who want to avoid a consultation with a doctor. So in COVID times right now, maybe you want to get ivermectin or you want to get hydroxychloroquine and your doctor's like, no, neither of those drugs actually work for COVID. I'm not going to write you a script. You may go online and try to buy it, and you may find someone who's willing to sell it to you, but I would be very concerned about the risk of a counterfeit medication in that scenario. So while some internet pharmacies are legitimate, others are illegal. They're selling medications, without prescriptions, and they may have unapproved or counterfeit products without even knowing it. And in some cases, illegal internet pharmacies are operated internationally and sell products that have unknown origins. Another shady variation to be aware of is pharmacies claiming to be Canadian. So this is a big thing in the U.S. Many of them are not Canadian at all, and they've been investigated by criminal, the FBI, et cetera. A lot of the times there's no Canadian connection at all except the name or the marketing. And some of them have been found to be fronts for organized crime and international terrorist organizations like Hezbollah. There's a perception in the U.S. that because Canada has a robust regulatory environment, buying drugs from Canadian pharmacies is somehow safe. Unfortunately, there are some big holes in this theory. First, as I mentioned, oftentimes these online pharmacies aren't even based in Canada, and they're entirely fraudulent. But even if they are in Canada, the Canadian regulatory system only applies to drugs intended to be sold in Canada. So if the products are marked not for use in Canada, then the Canadian rules don't apply. And US patients could be exposed to very dangerous products, all the while thinking they're safe. So my last example here, where when I said Canadian rules don't apply to drugs marked not for use in Canada, is an example of something called parallel distribution. So parallel distribution is essentially the existence of a secondary channel that allows products to be sold outside of the manufacturer's authorized distribution plan for that market. So Canada and the EU are both areas where their laws permit parallel distribution. I'm not taking a position on it, but I'm pointing out that parallel trade or parallel distribution systems can be another entry point for counterfeit products. It may be easier to understand parallel trade if you think about products like luxury goods, maybe a Louis Vuitton bag. The place to buy a legit Louis Vuitton bag around here is from one of their stores, their online site, their authorized online site, or an upscale retailer like Nordstrom. These are the authorized sources. If you're buying a Louis Vuitton bag purchased online from an unfamiliar entity, you would probably want to be very careful to ensure you're getting a legit product if that's your goal. You could be buying an authentic bag intended for sale in a country where the prices are lower, or you could be buying a secondhand bag, but you could also be buying a fake. 25 years ago, you had to go to Canal Street in Manhattan or a local flea market to buy fake luxury goods from vendors doing business in vans parked on side streets. Today, these operations all have websites and are able to sell their fake goods across the country. So clearly, this is a problem for luxury goods manufacturers, but they are very little public safety risk. With pharmaceuticals, counterfeits can be deadly. Let's move to the next slide, Andy. We'll talk about some of the controls in the U.S. pharmaceutical supply chain, since that's where most of us are getting our medications. So I mentioned earlier that most sources estimate counterfeit drugs are less than 1% of the total U.S. drug supply. So let's put that into context. Americans take a lot of drugs. We fill almost 6 billion prescriptions per year. Almost half of all Americans have taken a prescription drug in the previous month. And some patients have so many prescriptions that the overall average per American is almost 20 prescriptions per year. So if we have a 1% rate of counterfeit meds, that means out of 6 billion prescriptions, up to 60 million could be fake. That's a lot. And in the US, we have a very robust legal and regulatory environment. So in addition to our state boards of pharmacy, which license pharmacies and wholesalers operating in their states, and the pharmacists that work there, by the way, there are several large government agencies with a charter to protect the safety and security of the US drug supply chain. So the Food and Drug Administration and the Drug Enforcement Agency are two ones that we're really familiar with. And they both have numerous programs specifically focused on protecting the US drug supply from counterfeits, as well as the work that they do to ensure quality and safety of legitimate approved medications. And through the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, NABP, We also have accreditations that consumers can use to identify legitimate accredited pharmacies. And also payers, so your employer, your health plan, whoever's paying for your medical care, they will contract often with like a PBM who has accreditation programs. And so we ensure that all of the pharmacies that are in our network are accredited and that they have ethical sourcing programs and controls around the drugs that they're purchasing. In addition to all of this, we have the upcoming final implementation of the Drug Supply Chain Safety Act in November 2023, which mandates end-to-end pedigree at the product level for most drugs dispensed in the US. Pharmacies will be able to see the entire supply chain journey of the product they procured through the pedigree, or transaction history, as we call it. And each product will be serialized with an online system for validating that serialization. CSA also created national standards for wholesalers, which has helped regulate the behaviors of those secondary wholesalers I mentioned previously. And because they have been a primary entry point for counterfeits into the US market. So at Express Scripts, we have extremely high standards related to drug sourcing and drug safety. So we only purchase drugs directly from the original manufacturer or from authorized distributors who are specifically authorized by the original manufacturer. We also hold accreditations from the National Associations, the Board of Pharmacy, and that is an exhaustive, thorough review of all aspects of the practice of pharmacy, including the efficacy of the controls we have in place for our pharmaceutical procurement processes. So Andy, we're going to move to the last slide here. So counterfeit drugs have been a concern in medicine since drugs were created. 400 years ago, malarial treatments were being counterfeited. And as drugs have become more standardized with fixed recipes and brand names and regulatory approvals tied to those recipes, counterfeiting has evolved. So how can you, as a likely consumer of pharmaceuticals purchased in the US, protect yourself from inadvertently buying counterfeit products? So I would say first and most importantly, use reputable and accredited pharmacies. These pharmacies are committed to ethically and safely sourcing pharmaceuticals so that they can provide excellent care to their patients. Their mission, brand, and corporate reputation are grounded in providing safe and affordable medications, and they're very invested in ensuring that their sourcing decisions, procurement practices, and processes are aligned with that mission. Secondly, avoid Canadian online pharmacies and other online sites that claim to import at lower prices. Teach your kids about counterfeit drugs and the dangers of acquiring medications or illicit drugs through social media. And lastly, support legislation and regulation that seeks to protect the security and integrity of our supply chain. As counterfeiters evolve, we need our framework to evolve as well, so we can rapidly and effectively respond to new tactics employed by fraudsters.